is happening. So welcome, James. Good to see you. I mean, this idea came about from some discussions that we had, and Andrew and Beth and I quite keen to have a higher profile for the research activity that's happening on the global scene, as it were, that relates to people who are in islands, who are living in islands, who are doing things, but also about people whose experiences are about studying islands from afar and island issues. So we want to try and get a UHI group together in the first instance on all different disciplines and see what we're doing in the various islands where we are, but extending that to other island groups across the globe and hearing from other areas. So we're quite pleased to have yourself coming here to kick this off, and we have a whole range of both staff and PhD students and some guests over the course of the next year. So I'm looking forward to that. We've been quite fortunate in the lockdown period to be able to sort of earwig in a whole range of conversations and webinars across the globe. So it's about time we started having a higher profile and putting that back into the system. So I'll hand over to Beth, and good to see everybody today.
Thanks, Frank, and welcome everybody. I just wanted to say a bit about the university and UHI. Really, I guess is a unique institute in a lot of respects, both in terms of the tertiary nature of what we do, but also because we are embedded in the islands and our island communities within the region that we serve and are part of. And the university's really articulated its commitment to those island communities through its island strategy that it published in 2020, and I'm leading on the implementation of that island strategy. So this seminar series is a really important strand of that, about communicating the fantastic research that's going on across the Highlands and Islands, and I keep unearthing new and exciting things almost every week. It's fantastic, but also the connectivity that we as island communities have globally, and I think very fitting that James is our first speaker today, both in terms of your being an alumni of the university, but also in terms of that global reach that island innovation has. So really excited about the opportunities that this series is going to present us in terms of sharing and connecting research activities that can support the communities that we are in. So thanks very much, Andrew, for the opportunity to introduce it, and welcome, James.
Thank you very much, Frank and Beth. So that puts it into context, James, why we've invited you. So on to the main course, and we're very pleased that we can kick off the webinar series with a talk from the extraordinary James Ellsmoor. James is a graduate of the Institute of Northern Studies, the Island Studies MLitt programme, and he's the UHI's Postgraduate Student of the Year in 2019 and the UHI Alumnus of the Year in 2020. James is the founder and director of Island Innovation, a global media platform which offers unique insights into island sustainability, and which has evolved into a community of, wait for it, 127,000 members. Goodness me. He's going to talk about what makes him tick. He's going to talk about island innovation and about the Virtual Island Summit, which this year had over 14,000 attendees with over 500 islands represented, and also COP, which he is involved in as well. So with that, over to you, James.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for that kind introduction, and I'm very happy to be here. Still looking for an excuse to make it back to Orkney or to Shetland for the first time, but for now, well, the virtual connection will have to do. And I think it's a real pleasure to be here. And even though I've, due to the pandemic, been out of Scotland for a little while now, I am very happy to still have been able to stay involved with the UHI community and stay plugged into all of the programs that you and the wider UHI community are involved in. So again, thank you to all the organizers for allowing me to participate in this today and to kick off this Island Matters series. I'll just share my screen. Hopefully you can, I'll assume you can see that unless I hear something. And I like this title of Island Matters. It's something, Islands Matter. This is something that has come up recently in a in a number of Europe actually just launched its podcast last week with the same name, Islands Matter, covering a very different group of islands to UHI, but something that clearly a phrase that clearly resonates more broadly. And when I saw that, I thought my first question was, who do islands matter to? And obviously we're talking about this in the context of islanders primarily, and islanders wanting to showcase the work that they're doing and the importance of the places that they live. But also I find that people living on islands constantly, whether it's for central government funding, whether it's for infrastructure projects or something else, constantly have to justify this of why they matter in a way that perhaps other communities don't have to do to the same level. So it's an important question to ask as well. Who do they matter to? Not just the residents, but whether for better or for worse, the people off the islands that are stakeholders in some way in those decisions. We live in a global archipelago. I love this map to give some context of the global archipelago. And today I just wanted to give some high-level framework of how I see global island connections. And a lot of this was really, the context for this, for me, really came from the UHI Island Studies Masters program, where we were able to really dig into what is islandness and what connects islands around the world. And it's something that sometimes for people who maybe less aware of these global island networks needs to be justified. I've certainly had eyebrows raised when talking to Scottish Islanders and making comparisons to Barbados, for example. People don't necessarily understand, firstly, why these islands on the other side of the world might be immediately relevant to their context. But I think what is really interesting during the pandemic, but even before the pandemic, is given the increase in the number of conversations like this, there is a growing awareness by institutions beyond UHI, businesses, governments, and NGOs of the value of sharing island information. And obviously that is now being recognized more and more by islanders themselves, who are the most active and vocal participants in these kind of conversations, which is really exciting. One thing that I think has really changed, just to give some context for how I work and how I wanted to frame this presentation for the conversation afterwards, is I think there was a growing tendency to decouple community and space. And what I mean by that is over the last 10 years, there's been this movement towards virtual communities, people being connected through the internet and primarily social media platforms, etc. And that's not to say that that's at the expense of in-person community. Clearly humans need a human connection and really value the people and community that they physically live in. But in addition to that, there's been this growth in virtual communities, and meaning that the place and space that you're in is in some ways less important for many things than it used to be, whether that's for your job, which has obviously in the last 2 years been very evident as more and more people work from home, but also in terms of access to information, access to discussions. And I think it's both an opportunity and a threat for many islands. Clearly, there's an important discussion to be had around housing, particularly in the Outer Hebrides and some other parts of Scotland, and the impact of people looking to islands as a place to live more and more, and the pros and cons of that. But there's also an opportunity in that there has developed this global community of people living in islands or remote places or isolated places to share information. And that's partly that's partly what we're contributing to with Island Innovation, but there's many other networks that have grown to do that, and so there's increasingly common that people are very, very aware of things that might be happening in islands on the other side of the world. They're involved in those communities with people that they've never met in person before, And for islanders that previously may have been isolated from discussions with other islands, this is a really exciting opportunity to share information, I think, and is a real change to how we think and act as people and interact with each other. Obviously, islands are often defined by isolation in some way. I use this picture of Tristan da Cunha as often known as the world's remotest island, population of just a few hundred people living on a 7 to 10 day cargo ship ride away from Cape Town. It doesn't get much more isolated from that. But just a few weeks ago, we were, through one of the programs Island Innovation organized, we were involved in an interactive discussion with islanders in Tristan da Cunha about how they can look to more effective ways of waste management and waste disposal in their extreme situation. And actually that was organized in collaboration with the Orkney International Science Festival, comparing approaches in Orkney and other parts of Scotland, and sharing those lessons with community members in Tristan da Cunha that were joining live for that conversation. I think that's a great example of this opportunity. Increasingly, what that means is that digital bridges are becoming more important than physical bridges. Clearly, over the last 10, 15 years, island internet connections have accelerated, have become much faster and more accessible for many islanders. But there are still some that get completely left out. And so I know that the Shetlanders among you often look to your neighbours to the north in the Faroe Islands for their high speed and very accessible internet services. But even among the Scottish Islands, the overall connectivity is much better than in some islands in other parts of the world. And in a way, these digital connections really impact how you can be involved in this global community and how you can also develop as an island community. So I think I've covered this already: island to island interactions, how there is an opportunity to share information, and I'm sure Andrew and Frank will have their own inputs on this as we go to the conversation afterwards on what this opportunity is. So I'll move on. Some of the things that I've noticed as general trends coming out of these conversations will be familiar to many of you, I'm sure, is that renewable energy and climate change to an extent are some of the core conversations that keep coming out. And I think those are really important conversations. So I wanted to flag those, but I think there is opportunity to go into many, to share information and experiences far beyond just renewable energy. But there is something right now around islands that really is attracting the interest of people in renewables, whether it's the UK government, Scottish government, EU government. All of these organizations are promoting island renewable initiatives. And I think if that can be leveraged in the right way, that's a really exciting opportunity for many islands. But it has to be done in a way that positions the islanders at the center of that, to give people living on those islands the autonomy to make decisions that work for them, and not just as let's say laboratories, which is a term I put in quotes because I think it's a controversial one, which benefit the people looking in as opposed to the people inside, the lab rats themselves. That's really what we want to avoid. So like all of these conversations, there's a double-edged sword. Renewable energy has a huge opportunity for Ireland, but it has to be done in a way that benefits people living in the place and is not just seen as an experiment from people outside. And I think there are some really good examples, such as Egg in the Inner Hebrides, that have really done that in a community-driven way, which a lot of other places around the world could learn for. I won't say specific examples right now, but there are other islands that outside of Scotland that I'm aware of, where there has been a kind of imposition of projects which may be green, but don't necessarily have the best interests of the people living there at heart. So moving on for that, I think what I wanted to share today was the way that I wanted to approach island connections. The big opportunity is making these connections between islands that may be in very different corners of the world, but to share information. But also beyond that, there are two other barriers that I think are really important. So one is the island jurisdictions. One of the really fascinating parts for me of island studies is comparing as an island studies geek, is comparing the jurisdictions and the power that that gives. Why can Shetland and the Faroe Islands, with their different levels of jurisdictions, have such different outcomes because of the different levels of autonomy that they have? How does that impact things? Or the Isle of Man and, the Isle of Man and the Isle of Arran, for example. And that goes beyond to look at a region like the Caribbean. How can the independent countries in the Caribbean, which will be sending delegations to Glasgow next month for the COP, why do they have the right to be represented independently, and other islands that may be even bigger by population, other islands that may be even bigger by population don't have that opportunity. And so I think bringing in the right for a county council like Orkney to interact with a sovereign state like Fiji, or a crown territory like a crown dependency like Jersey, that's also an important area, because population is irrelevant to many of those islands. Some of the territories may be far larger than some of the independent countries, but these political divisions that exist kind of create barriers between different islands for interaction, and that's still something that exists right now for sharing information. And then the third thing, which I think is really important, and that's why I'm really happy to be here for one of these pillars today, is what we call the quadruple helix. So how can government, society, academia, and the private sector share information and collaborate? Because often, and this especially apparent on small island communities, these different sectors have different approaches. They don't necessarily interact with each other, even if they have the same goals. And there needs to be an integrated approach. So there's barriers in different ways, which I think islands can benefit from breaking down. So I'm almost going to wrap up. I just wanted to share a little bit about the work that I do at Island Innovation with our team. So we have a team of 12 now that are based on different islands all around the world, from Guadeloupe to the Philippines, and many in between. We have a global team. So we launched an event called the Virtual Island Summit, which was mentioned in the introduction, and we held a few weeks ago. And interestingly enough, we actually launched the first one before the pandemic. So using these virtual connections, just like UHI, and a lot of this came from the inspiration of studying at UHI, making these virtual connections before and seeing the value of this is not just something that we're doing right now to get through the pandemic, but a prolonged opportunity that we should be using. And so this year we were really proud to have several presidents and prime ministers of island countries speak, representatives from over 500 islands around the world participate, and use this as an opportunity to share information. We also have the Island Ambassadors Program. So we have this year nearly 400 ambassadors who take a role for a year as part of the program to make a connection between these global discussions and implementation locally on their own islands. We'd love to have more ambassadors from different Scottish islands. So please do get in touch if that's something that you know anyone that might be interested in. But again, to try and make these connections and have individuals that can represent those discussions is very important for that. And then finally, and if this is of interest to people, I wanted to mention it, being that the world is descending on Scotland in just under a month. I wanted to mention the COP26. And so I think this is particularly relevant for islands given that 1/3 of COP delegations, or sorry, 1/4 of COP member states are island countries. Barbados, Fiji, Malta, Madagascar all send their own delegations there. And so that's very, very relevant in terms of islands having a voice at those discussions. But of course, many islands are not directly represented themselves at the COP, including the Scottish Islands. You could argue that, let's say, Caribbean territory like the British Virgin Islands has very different interests than the delegation from London that is representing it. And maybe that applies to the Scottish Islands as well. And so given the challenges of this year for many islanders to participate and have their voice heard at the COP, we wanted to create a hybrid space to connect the discussions in Glasgow with islanders around the world and make that information available to them. So happy to discuss the COP a little bit more, but I think in a way this is an opportunity for all of the theory that I discussed of island connections to really be applied in a real conversation around climate change. And I know that there are various efforts from Orkney Islands Council to the Scottish Government to various ministries in London to showcase what islands are experiencing as some of the most vulnerable places to climate change, but also solutions coming from islands that impact sustainability and climate. So I gave a few different points. I would be very interested to see your comments or questions in the chat, and whichever of those are interesting, we can have a bit of a chat about now with the moderators. If you have any interest, feel free to reach out to me. If you like Twitter, do send me a tweet. It would be great to hear if you're on there and you've been involved in today's discussion. And thank you very much.
Thank you, James, for that sort of introductory overview to the things that you're involved in. And there are some questions already in the chat, and I'm sure people want to know more about some of the specific some details about what you were talking about. I'll just I'll kick it off, and then I'm sure we'll pick some questions from the chat, and then see who else would like to follow things up. You've got a sort of global perspective on islands that is pretty much unique, I think, because of all your connections and your networking. And one of the things that we're really keen to focus on in this webinar series is research, and to find out what research is sort of being undertaken across the Scottish Islands. But I was wondering, from the sort of global perspective, looking down, do you have sort of any examples of cutting edge island research that you've come across, either in the Virtual Island Summit or through your connections with island innovation?
Well, you put me on the spot there. I guess more, well, I think one of the really interesting things about UHI, sorry, my connection seems to have slowed a bit down, but tell me if it's okay.
That's fine.
One of the really interesting things with UHI is being, for want of a better word, indigenous island organization, having those bases on the islands. I think a lot of island research that I've seen, and particularly in developing countries and in developing regions, has tended to be quite extractive. Researchers coming in from mainland organizations, and probably this also applies in many of the Scottish Islands as well, taking studies, using people's time to investigate, and then not really doing anything, or even sending the results of that, making that available to the people that they were talking to. And so I think there is a growing recognition of that. There's a number of island-based universities. I was very privileged when I was studying at UHI to go to Okinawa in Japan as part of the RETI network, the Island Universities Network. that I think was particularly interesting for focusing on these island-based universities as part of the studies. And so obviously there are others like University of Prince Edward Island that have this island-centric knowledge. And so I think that change for me is really interesting, or not necessarily a change, but a increase in those local institutions that are able to do that. In terms of specific research, so I'm not really an academic, although I try and keep a foot in academia to be able to help apply that. I'll share in the chat, but one quite interesting piece that we were engaged with recently, which was led by the University of Strathclyde, was a COVID-19 island response series, where they did a series of papers looking at how jurisdiction impacted response to COVID-19. And so just that last week, I'm sorry, UPEI was also involved in that, I should have said. And maybe Laura, if you're there, you can share a link in the chat for anyone interested. One piece that came out last week was looking at Tierra del Fuego in Patagonia, which as a single island divided between Chile and Argentina led to very different responses on each side of the island. And so I think this kind of political approach, but looking at the real world implications of that for people living on those islands is super interesting and very valuable in a practical way.
Thank you very much. And it's good to see UHI there as a sort of exemplar. That's good. Excellent. And I see Frank's nodding his head. I think he's got something to say.
Well, I always have something to say, Andrew. No, I never thought about myself as a lab rat before, but you've absolutely put your finger right on it. I was arguing just recently with some institutions and government institutions that we're all encouraged to be inclusive these days, to be gender inclusive, racially inclusive, etc. It's sad that it's taken a pandemic to force us to be geographically inclusive, and that now I'm able to take part in various things that are not in the location where I'm based in the far northwest of the Outer Hebrides. And it's a soapbox of mine to say that, you know, we should be making more of the laboratories right outside their door. If you study, you know, bird species on the Hebridean Macar, you should be based on the Hebridean Macar and contributing jobs and families in that area to while you're studying, because you know, the argument used to be you needed access to big university libraries, and all that is online now. So let's get them out of the cities and into the rural areas and actually see the benefits where they are. So I'm quite fascinated by your quadruple helix thing. I don't know if you have any examples of where that, I mean, I know they have field stations and all this sort of stuff, but I'm talking about actual bases, permanent bases there, as there is in Svalbard, for example, which I visited years ago. Have you any examples of that you can share with us?
Sure, there's a couple of different points there, Frank. I'll try and address one. I mean, another one, the research institution you mentioned in Svalbard is a good example. Another one I'm a big fan of is the South Atlantic Environmental Research Institute in Stanley in the Falkland Islands. I think they have done a really good job of bringing researchers to actually be based in the Falkland Islands and also give opportunities to Falkland Islanders. Tara Palembe, who's led that, and also the programs in St. Helena and now Anguilla, all of which are quite small islands without academic infrastructure. But by partnering with networks of larger universities, I think, again, has that local base that allows that to be useful and applied in the local context. In terms of the quadruple helix, yeah, it's maybe difficult to point to specific examples, but really what I'm doing is trying to make increase communication. And it's easy to say, oh, well, the Scottish Islands need to talk to Tasmania or the South Pacific, but also it's amazing how often we have done programs where people on the same island have met each other through one of our virtual global events, because maybe even though they're working on the same thing, one is in the private sector, one is in a university, and one is in government, and they don't talk to each other, and they take different approaches. And that is a general problem, that these different sectors use different words and have different approaches. but it's easy to think about this globally and then be amazed how often that has happened. Honestly, we've made those connections, or even more often, there tend to be islands that are right next to each other, and that outsiders might group them together. I mean, you can say Orkney and Shetland, where people from outside the region might kind of assume they're together, but there is actually less interaction. Jersey and Guernsey, Martinique and Guadeloupe, they're all islands that from the outside have a lot in common, get grouped together, but actually locally there may be less of that cooperation or discussion. And I think I think trying to build some of those bridges and between the different sectors is really useful.
Thank you very much. Following up, I think we've got Laurie's question here, because a number of us are interested in creating networks and having connections to other people in different islands and different places. Laurie and myself are both curious how you've managed to build such extensive networks in such a short time. How have you achieved 137,000 people? How is that possible?
So I mean, we don't have a membership structure, so no one is exactly a member directly of Island Innovation, and so how you count that depends on which numbers you're using and how often, but including all the people who've participated in the event, read the newsletter, participate in our online groups. Obviously you get a larger number. Clearly not all of those are participating in everything, but as I say, I was really proud to have, for the second year running, over 10,000 people register for the Virtual Island Summit. And I think trying to focus on creating interesting discussions, I think we've been really happy that with the team, and I should say Island Innovation is not just me. We have a team of people who put all of these things together and use their own networks. And so having native speakers of French, Spanish, Portuguese on that team. Recently we've had a new person join who lives on an island in Brazil and has started opening up Brazilian islands and opportunities in Brazilian islands to participate in this network. I think that's one of the areas where we're still struggling is language, because honestly, it's so expensive to provide interpretation. It's not practical. And so I would love to be able to create more inclusivity for non-English speakers. I think also some of the East Asian islands, it's been harder to create that involvement because of the language barrier. But I would say it's a lot of perseverance, a lot of reaching out and leveraging other networks. So often there are the Scottish Islands Federation, for example, is an active local network within Scotland, and there are parallel networks in Denmark and the Philippines and the South Pacific that also have different networks. So it's very broad in many senses, although very focused on islands, but then within islands covering a very, very wide range of issues, which can be challenging because it's so broad in a way. And so people may be only interested in a very small niche of that conversation, maybe only the energy conversation or only the tourism conversation. But from where I sit, if you're looking at an island economy or an island system, you can't talk about tourism without talking about energy and waste disposal and marine conservation. They all link on some level, which comes back to that breaking down silos and making connections within a system.
Do you think there's something particular about islands that predisposes people to take part and to network? Because you've been very successful in getting presidents and policymakers and researchers and citizens, as Laurie puts it, to take part and to share their time and their experience. Do you think it's is it an island thing?
I think so. I think that definitely helps and creates an interest. I mean, some of these networks did exist to a point. There were various island networks, before Island Innovation, of course. I'm not saying that we didn't, but I think what I wanted to do was make it accessible. So I'd actually attended the last 3 or 4 COPs, the climate conferences, with the Seychelles delegation, with an island delegation, and I'd seen that there were the same people coming every year and having the same conversations, and those were the people that had the resources to be able to get there, including myself, and to be able to participate. And there was a lot of useful information there, but it was shut behind closed doors. And so for me, I wanted to create a space that was more open and inclusive and accessible, which comes with its own challenges, but means that there might be a small group with 3 people who are working on turtle conservation in their very small islands, which, you know, there's no way that they have the resources to go to these big global conferences. But as Frank said, maybe having access to that information is something that they can then apply to what they're doing in a low resource context. That inclusivity element was really, and I think this exactly as you said, Frank, with this inclusivity of geography. Even if we tried to do this virtual island summit in person, we'd need a multi-million-dollar budget, multi-million-pound budget just for the flights. And then it would be, you know, we have to discuss how we talk about climate change after flying people in from all over the world. So I think being able to make that inclusivity for islands is really important, and that attracted people in.
Thank you. There's a question after my own heart here, actually.
I knew you were going to jump on this.
When I heard that COP26 was coming to Glasgow, I thought, hang on a minute, what's that going to do to the CO2 budget for Scotland? All these flights, and Carola has posited the same question. Do you think it's really necessary for this monumental event to be taking place physically when it's possible to do it virtually?
Now, we could do a whole webinar series on this question. I think there's a lot to unpack there. There's a couple of things. So I disagree with you on this, Andrew. I do think that although there are people flying in from all over the world, the contribution, the cost benefit analysis it makes it worthwhile. It's impossible to do something without burning carbon, and the value of these COP conversations is important. The fact that with all of the shortcomings of the Paris Agreement, the fact that you could have Saudi Arabia and Russia and the US and the Marshall Islands all agree on something is pretty powerful, even if there could have been a lot more teeth in it. And so I think that these conversations do have a role. And actually what the last year and a half has proven is that a lot of particularly for the delegates, for the negotiators, it's very difficult to do that virtually because so much of it relies on personal trust, personal communications. And so I'm not advocating the end of conferences and end of in-person interactions by any means. I think these are 2 different things that have different roles. And I know that on the political level, that doing this virtually, you would not be able to build the same trust and relationships between delegates, which, for better or for worse, these kind of conversations hinge on. Now, there's another argument about the whole circus that goes with the COP of all the other things happening on the sidelines, whether that's necessary, because that is quite different than the core negotiations. But that's maybe a different conversation as well. And I totally understand the premise of the question. I think a really important element this year is also going to be the inclusive. How, if you can't have all 190 something member states represented, can you have a real conversation? And this existed before the COP. There was this bias. I think 5 of the last 10 COPs or something like that have been in Europe, which clearly is a big bias of who can access and who is leading those conversations. This year you have compounded with that the challenge of African and South Pacific delegations, particularly being able to travel to Europe and participate. And even if the UK government has made efforts to ensure that the delegations from those countries can get here. The 2-week quarantine either side and all these other things mean it's going to be very challenging for some of the worst affected countries by climate change to actually have their voice heard. And I think not enough attention has been to that. So there is there's always going to be an equity issue with COP and who is having their voice heard, who is participating, who is being involved. And I think the pandemic kind of pushed that a little bit. It's going to be really challenging for the South Pacific Islands, who are the most vulnerable to climate change, to even have a physical presence, let alone have their activist or civil society delegations that would normally be there being here. I do think that there's a really exciting opportunity for the Scottish Islands to showcase all of the amazing things happening in the Scottish Islands and make those connections. And I know that there are efforts by UK, Scottish governments and various other island organisations to make the most of this and to put and to put projects happening in the Scottish Islands on the map. So sorry, I was a very long-winded answer to that question, but as I said, we could do a whole webinar series on it.
Thank you, very much there, James. And the the self-catering industry in Glasgow, of course, is very much agrees with you there. So, what else can we say? We've covered a lot of fascinating subjects there. One of the things you said, you might tell us a little bit more about the Island Innovation Ambassador system. I think people would be interested to hear about that, because you might get some potential candidates from this meeting.
Absolutely, and in fact, I would love help from the UHI system to make sure we have more Scottish Islands in our ambassador program for next year. The idea of the ambassador program was really to help make up for the fact that this is all virtual and all digital, to help make a physical connection. Because although we're talking, and I can see the comments in the chat, I really agree that virtual is more inclusive in many ways. It also often attracts the same type of person. There's a lot of people living on the islands who might never even think to participate in a virtual conference, who would definitely participate in something physical. And so the idea of the ambassadors program originally, and we're hoping this will happen on a larger scale, was to actually have a series of physical gatherings happening on islands around the world during this big global virtual conversation, to help translate that into a local context. So, okay, we're having all these great conversations about whatever topic, but how do we make that relevant locally? And I was really happy this year we had the Falkland Islands government organized a screening in Stanley of several sessions, agriculture and tourism and something else, and then use that as an opportunity to bring in local stakeholders and think about how those lessons can be applied in that context. Last year, we also had the St. Helena Community College do public screenings of the Virtual Island Summit and invite the general public in. And this year, actually, a lot of the summit was streamed on St. Helena's TV station and was made even more accessible there. And the role of the ambassadors, which clearly didn't happen as had been expected this year because of the pandemic, will be to help facilitate that, to make those connections between the global, high level, very broad conversation, and then think about how to make this connection locally. And so I think we're going to push to have more local partners of local organizations that can maybe help to organize those in-person conversations for next year. Obviously, we'll keep our fingers crossed that next year will be a bit more normal and we can do these in-person things. Also, the island space that we're creating around the COP is similar in a way, trying to find the sweet spot of the inclusivity and participation that the virtual event allows, but then the local kind of personal, real connections that are still important as a human to be able to move things forward. So we're still experimenting with what hybrid means, and the ambassadors will be a big part of those connections. And I would say, sorry, one more thing on the ambassadors. it's really interesting. We have such a wide range. So not only are they global in scope, we have 18-year-old high school students who participate, but also heads of government departments and CEOs of businesses. So even within that network, it's the criteria to join was enthusiasm as opposed to a CV, and that's, I think, been a really interesting outcome of that. And I know a lot of our ambassadors have been able to benefit from making those connections within the program as well.
That's fantastic, James. Frank, I wonder if you get any sort of final question or thought about how this could tie into our ideas for the future about promoting the research that's taking place across our islands.
I think it's a very auspicious start, so thank you, James. That was a really useful, and I mean, as you said, there's lots of herrings been waved around, and some of them were read and otherwise. But in terms of the possible topics we could discover from this one webinar are immense. I hope we can maintain some communication with that over the future, because I think it's important that not only we get the message out for what's happening in the Scottish Islands and the sort of stuff we're doing, some very high level groundbreaking research, but also finding out what other people are doing and using that to inform our position. Even if it's a contrast to what we're doing, that's good as well. And I tell my daughters that even I don't believe in everything I say. So you have to remember that there's a contrasting opinion across the globe. So that's a great start, and I hope we have discussions that we might maintain these networks and make them mutually supportive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. And I've just got maybe one last thing to ask you, James. Is there any? Well, you've mentioned that the UHI could be involved more with the Island Ambassadors scheme, but is there any other way that you could see that Island Innovation and the island-based centres in UHI might be able to collaborate on things?
Mm-hmm. So one interesting opportunity will obviously be for the events that we have. I've been in touch with a few different researchers at UHI on various projects, and I think whenever there is interesting research that has this broader applicability, would love to know about it. I'm quite happy, we have our weekly newsletter and portals for transmitting information, and so whenever there are new studies and publications, please do send them. I put my email in the chat. Please do send them our way for dissemination. Also, as I mentioned, in the immediate future, would encourage you to register for our COP island space, which will be essentially, the idea of that is during the COP, we'll be sending a daily update of anything island related that has happened during the COP. And so again, if you know of things that may be happening across the Scottish Islands during the COP that are COP related, please do send them our way. One thing which I haven't officially said anywhere yet, but just to float the idea, is we were looking at within Island Innovation of having some kind of specific academic network, academic council to leverage Island Innovation. I'm very conscious of not duplicating the existing networks that already exist, and it's been something that's been on the back burner for a little while. But I think that we do have an opportunity to leverage the Island Innovation Network, and I think one issue with if you don't mind me saying, one issue with a lot of academic publications is their accessibility for and so if we're able to be a place that disseminates, breaks down academic research and publishes that in an accessible way, as with the COVID-19 Island research program, I think that's where we can really be a channel to disseminate that information. So yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciated the conversation, the opportunity to talk. It's been a real pleasure, and I really would be keen to find ways to collaborate with the UHI centres more, and definitely am open to ideas on how we can do that.
Thank you very much, James. Yeah, well, from our side, we'd love to do that too. So, well, I think we'll round it up there. Thank you for getting us off to a fantastic start, and as Frank was saying, opening up a whole range of different discussion topics that we can think about in future. And yeah, we look forward to collaborating with you on many things as time goes by. So thank you very much, James. And thank you everyone for attending, and hopefully you've all been inspired. And we'll see you at the next webinar in a couple of weeks' time. So all the best. Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.